Promising Young Woman made me realize that even after all these years, I still remember every goddamn lyric to Paris Hilton's Stars Are Blind.
We have a wonderful evening's entertainment lined up for you.
23.
Hey, what is up, you guys? This is Steffi, aka In My Humble Opinion, and welcome back to another movie review. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about one of my personal most anticipated movies. I'm probably one of the last people to do a review about this movie on YouTube, and that's just because, you know, I'm late to things, but here we are, better late than never, and that movie is Promising Young Woman. So, Promising Young Woman stars Carey Mulligan, Bo Burnham, Laverne Cox, Alison Brie, and notable cameos by Adam Brody, Christopher Mintz-Plasse, Connie Britton, Molly Shannon, Jennifer Coolidge, and Max Greenfield. Now, this movie, of course, was written and directed, yes, written and directed by Emerald Fennell or Emerald Fennell. I've heard it both ways. But, yeah, she wrote and directed this movie, and I just have to take a pause here and say, I feel like based on what I watched on my channel last year, it has unknowingly led me to watching Promising Young Woman. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Emerald Fennell was the head writer of season 2 of Killing Eve, which was one of my favorite shows that I watched on my channel last year, and is honestly one of my favorite shows that I've ever watched, period. And then a couple months later, I watched The Crown on my channel, The Crown season 4, and Emerald Fennell played Camilla Parker Bowles. So clearly she is a woman of many talents, and I can most definitely see how the woman who was in charge of writing season 2 of Killing Eve would then be involved in a project like Promising Young Woman. So Promising Young Woman is about a young woman named Cassandra, played by Carey Mulligan, who after being traumatized by a tragic event in her past, seeks out vengeance against those who crossed her path. So, with that being said, as in all my movie reviews, I'm going to be talking about my personal pros and my cons, and then I'm also going to specifically talk about the ending of this movie because it is, you know, a bit polarizing, and I don't want to give any spoilers away throughout my review, so if you haven't seen Promising Young Woman yet, just skip over to this time stamp right here once I finish my cons, so you won't be spoiled about what happens in the end, but we're gonna get into that ending as well. So yes, I'm gonna be talking about the pros, the cons, that ending, and then I'm gonna give my overall grade for this movie. So let's get into this movie review. Alright, so the pros. My first pro to this movie is, of course, just the overall style, look, aesthetic of the film. I would say that the use of color plays a huge role in how this particular story is told, and they use a very specific color palette, and that color palette, for the most part, is this sweet, candy color coded world. You see a lot of pinks, you see a lot of baby blues, some hints of yellows and purples thrown in there. That's a color scheme that we would stereotypically associate with women, and I feel like by using that color palette, it gave a very distinct female presence to the movie. And it served as a great contrast to the scenes that would then go on to take place in the more male-dominated spaces. My second pro to this movie is the soundtrack. Oh, the soundtrack for this movie for me is so good, and it's so on point, and it just like fits the overall aesthetic and feel of the movie. So throughout Promising Young Woman, they really rely heavily on pop music, specifically from the early to the mid 2000s. And so you hear a string version of Britney Spears' Toxic, which also is featured in the trailer for this movie. You also hear Spice Girls' When Two Become One at the very beginning of the movie. The most notable like musical moment of Promising Young Woman is when Carey Mulligan and Bo Burnham are in a pharmacy and they're singing along to Paris Hilton's Stars Are Blind. So for me, growing up in the 2000s, this music feels very nostalgic to me. In fact, I remember when I was 14 years old, and as a party favor for my 14th birthday, I burned CD mixes for all of my friends, and one of the songs on that CD mix was Paris Hilton's Stars Are Blind. So yeah, nostalgia. But I wanted to include here a clip of Emerald Fennell talking about why she chose this music.
And I think the thing is that you often find this with pop music or like popular culture, particularly pop culture that young women like, is it's sort of treated ironically, or it's treated like a guilty pleasure. But I've always loved Britney Spears, and I think Toxic is one of the greatest songs ever written. And so I kind of wanted to, actually the whole movie in general, I wanted to kind of make sure that these things that we kind of think of as silly and our culture dismisses, like clothes, makeup, pop music, stuff that, you know, some women, not all women, enjoy, treat it seriously.
And yeah, you know what? I just have to take a second here and say I totally agree with that. As someone who hosts a podcast really about women, I host a podcast called Diva Dailies where we deconstruct divas on film, TV, and in music. That is the hill that I am willing to die on. But I love that Emerald Fennell basically chose this music because she was trying to make a point that it's okay to like these sorts of things and it's okay to think it's important. Additionally, I just have to say as well, I'm sure this wasn't planned, but this kind of just goes to show how perfectly timed this movie was. I think it is interesting that specifically having music cues from Paris Hilton and Britney Spears, considering that these are two women that really ruled the early to mid 2000s. And more recently too, there have been two notable documentaries, one that Paris Hilton herself put out and another that was about Britney Spears. And in those two documentaries, they really reframed the narrative and started making us think differently about how we perceive these women based on the way media told their stories. It's just so fitting and it's just interesting. And Britney Spears and Paris Hilton, I watched both of those documentaries. They were two women who were in their own separate ways sort of screwed over by the media and this like patriarchal system, and to have their music then be used in a movie that shows how a patriarchal system that protects men screwed over these women, it's just very meta. So I just wanted to point that out. Alright, my third pro to this movie is the casting. So I think specifically casting actors who we tend to associate as playing these like non-threatening nice guys, like Adam Brody, who played Seth Cohen in the OC. He was like the nice guy in that show. Or Max Greenfield, who played Schmidt in New Girl. These are actors who they tend to play nice guys, or the roles that they've made most famous, they were nice guys. So I thought those casting choices were really smart. And then also just this idea too of like the nice guy, like what is the nice guy? Do nice guys really exist? Is it possible for a nice guy to have done something shady in his past but still be a nice guy? But in general, just really brought home the idea that just because you're a nice guy doesn't mean that you're entitled to doing whatever you want with a woman. Alright, my fourth pro to this movie is the performances, specifically the performance by Carey Mulligan. She's very good in this movie. Like, this really is the Carey Mulligan movie. It is the Carey Mulligan show. I understand why she is a part of the awards season conversation, because this is really a movie about her character. And I think Carey Mulligan just did a really great job of portraying someone who was dealing with a lot of grief. And you have to give credit to Carey Mulligan as well, because we don't necessarily see the event that is the thing that gives her her grief. Like, the minute we are introduced to Carey Mulligan's character, there's this heaviness about her. And for us as the audience to already buy into the fact that, oh yes, this person clearly just went through a traumatic event, despite us not seeing said traumatic event take place on screen, like, that's really good. And additionally too, like, she has those scenes where she will be like pretending to be drunk and then she'll snap and then she is coherent again. So I think Carey Mulligan does a really great job in this movie. You see a good amount of range from her. And my fifth pro to this movie is that I love that Promising Young Woman is really an examination on the complicit. Okay, so this is like really awkward, but my camera died in the middle of me recording, and then when I went back to film the next part, I didn't realize that my footage was kind of messed up looking until I started editing, and I started editing at night. So the next time you see me, it's gonna be nighttime, and I'm gonna look a little different. Well, not that different, but it's a different angle. Okay. So let's just pretend like nothing has changed, and thank you for your patience and concern. So for me, Promising Young Woman really isn't male bashing. It's not about making men look bad. In fact, the movie goes out of its way to show you that men and women were complicit in this situation. And as a whole, I feel like Promising Young Woman's thesis is really about holding people who participate in a system that allows these men to get away. It's about holding those people accountable. So of course, in the context of Promising Young Woman, this included the lawyer, school administration, even classmates who did nothing. So as a whole, just seeing the different way in which those people tried to justify why they didn't say anything, why they didn't do anything, was just really interesting. And it was a creative way of opening up the narrative so that this movie wasn't just solely about what happened between victim and victee, but instead was commentary about the larger system at play here that, again, just allows men to get away with things. Men in this case. Alright, so now let's get into some of the cons. So my con for this movie is at times I felt like the tone and pacing was a bit uneven. For me personally, I felt like there were some places in the movie where it did drag a little bit, and throughout the movie while you're watching, sometimes you feel like you're watching two different movies because there's two very distinct tones. You have like the revenge thriller plot line, but then you also have this like indie rom-com thing happening whenever Bo Burnham appears on the scene. Of course, those two narratives do come together at some point, but it was just something that I observed and noticed and kind of bothered me a little bit, but it didn't bother me too much. But for the sake of this review, I'm listing it as a con. Alright, so now I'm gonna be talking about the end, so I'm gonna put the timestamp up here to where you can fast forward so that you won't get spoiled if you are watching this review and you haven't watched the movie. Please, if you are one of those people that hasn't watched the movie and you're watching this review, like, skip to the timestamp because this is a movie you do not want to be spoiled what happens at the end, so you have been warned. Okay, so now let's talk about that ending. Okay, so for me, the more I think about it, the more I like the ending, and honestly, that's the ending that makes the most sense when thinking about the story that was told in this movie. If after everything that occurred in this movie, you thought that Cassandra, Carey Mulligan's character, was gonna prevail and triumph over this man, I genuinely do not know what movie you were watching, because this entire movie showed how all these different people continually got away with not speaking up, not doing anything, and it showed how this system just continually fails, in this case, women. Of course, not all victims of like sexual assault and rape, they're not all women, but you know, in the context of this movie, this is about two women, really, the friend and Cassandra, that were wronged. Of course, when I was watching the ending, I was genuinely shocked, but at the same time, I wasn't surprised, and I feel like the way in which Emerald Fennell wrote this ending was the most true to the tone of the story that she told. Do not be fooled by the fact that you hear Britney Spears and Paris Hilton songs in the movie, or that the movie is really pretty to look at. This is a very bleak story. Again, the fact that our protagonist dies, that unfortunately is something that usually happens in cases like this. It's the Hollywood ending for a woman to somehow make it out alive from these situations. This is what tends to happen in real life. So from a creative standpoint too, I would just like to say that I think the fact that they killed off our protagonist, who we spent most of our time with in this movie, they killed her off and we're left the last 10-15 minutes without her, was a really bold choice. And it was a choice that literally left me on the edge of my seat, and I was like, oh my goodness, what happens now? Even though she wasn't literally on screen, we did still feel her presence when we saw her get her vengeance in the end, because she's a meticulous lady. But the more I think about it, the more I genuinely do think this was the most fitting ending. And for the Killing Eve fans out there, you may have noticed that in that last montage where the police are going to the wedding and we find out Cassandra's plans are in full force right now, there's a song called Angel of the Morning that starts to play. And if you watched Killing Eve season 2, that song also plays during the Amsterdam episode when Villanelle's looking at herself and she's like crying in the mirror. That song plays, except it's sung in a different language. So I just think it's really interesting that like Angel of the Morning in Emerald Fennell's cinematic universe, like clearly she really enjoys that song. Alright, so my overall grade rating for Promising Young Woman is a solid B+, but honestly, the more I think about it, I think I might bump it up to an A-. Promising Young Woman, despite its sweet color palette and 2000s pop soundtrack, is a movie that challenges us to look at a deeply flawed system and examine how and why people remain complicit participants. Its subject matter is timely, but at the same time not, because this is something that has been happening to women for many years. And while the ending is polarizing, I can respect that this is a movie made with distinct intentional choices. Emerald Fennell has a very clear voice and point of view, and I genuinely cannot wait to watch what she writes and directs next. Her work exudes unapologetically bold, feminine energy, and in the words of Paris Hilton,
that's hot.
All right, well, that about ends this review of Promising Young Woman. And if you like this movie review, please give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to hit the subscribe and notification button so you know when a new video from me comes out. And comment down below your thoughts on Promising Young Woman. Maybe put a spoiler alert in your comment section if you do start talking about the ending, because if you watch this review and you haven't seen the movie, hopefully you skipped that part where I talked about the ending. Like, man, you do not want to be spoiled when it comes to Promising Young Woman. Additionally, too, I have a hunch that if you like this movie, you will genuinely enjoy the podcast that I host, that I created. It's called Diva Dailies. It's a podcast where we deconstruct divas on film, TV, and in music. And not only do we review the movie or the TV episode or the album that the diva has made, but we talk about what it did in the diva's career, why she did it, the pop culture social climate of the time. Did it positively or negatively affect the diva's career? We talk about all those sorts of things, and it's really interesting to, you know, see the way in which media plays a role in either boosting or pulling down a woman's career. Yeah, check that podcast out if you haven't already. That's pretty much it from me. As always, everything I said was just my own personal thoughts and all my humble opinion, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!